Hello everyone and welcome to our presentation on ethical dimensions of the European migration policy. People move. Since the Neolithic age, mostly because they wanted to conquer new land for the expanding population. Since then, the movement of people come along with complex, interconnected political, cultural, and economic changes. Today, the world is organized around nation-states, which exercise the legal authority to control their borders. New migration patterns and an increasing fluidity of national borders and cultures came up, demanding for transnational mobility, as we could see especially in Europe from 2015 on. Due to national immigration laws, many people are prohibited to move. But what is the ethical justification on these restrictions to migration? This is our guiding question for the following presentation. In the following, we hope to give you an overview on theoretical and practical perspectives on migration. Firstly, we present theoretical assumptions focusing on borders and identity. Then we will talk about the European migration policy specifically. As a third step, we will introduce you to the main aspects and the pros and cons of the European-Turkish deal. After that, we show you a short video about the latest developments on the renewal of the deal before we end with a discussion and a role play. To begin with, we want to have a brief look at the Universal Declaration on Human Rights on the topic of migration and refugees. Article 13. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Second, everyone has the right to leave any country, including hers or his own, and to return to hers or his country. Article 14. Everybody has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. Since the declaration was written over 7 centuries ago, the EU has to challenge the process of migration stronger than ever. Migrants are human beings with rights. States have an obligation to protect them. But the Declaration of Human Rights is not a treaty and therefore not a directly legally binding law for countries. Thus, many different political assumptions and moral perspectives are discussed on how to handle migration ethically on an international level. In the following, we present you a small outline of approaches and opinions. Michael Walzer is one of the leading agents of the communitarian approach in political theory. In his book Theories of Justice from 1983, Walzer defends a moderate communitarianism, emphasizing the value of a community in relationship with the individual membership. He defines community as a meeting of individuals around a shared understanding. Individuals who are well integrated into these communities are able to reason and act in responsible ways. Walzer argues that the primary duty of care that members of a community owe to each other is the communal provision of security and welfare. The maintenance of these standards, which inherently involves maintenance of the community itself, justifies high entrance policies. Walzer argues that the exclusion of persons is therefore justified by the right of communities for self-determination. So, if the numbers of migrants ever threaten the provision of security and welfare, from Walzer's perspective, there is a strong communitarian argument for refusing immigrants in order to protect the existing community, its political sovereignty, and its ability to sustain a common life. In contrast to cosmopolitarian, liberal, and normative approaches, which are arguing from a universal ethical theory basis, are mostly in favor of open borders. In his article, The Communitarian Critique of Liberalism from 1990, Walzer is criticizing the liberal argumentation. In his opinion, liberal theories are hardly realistic to implement. they would struggling against culture, traditions, and authorities. A membership community from Walzer's perspective is more valuable. However, Walzer is arguing for a pro-multicultural communitarianism. There are other researchers, like Michael Sandel, who is using the communitarian approach to reflect his anti-liberal and pro-national arguments. One of the most well-known political philosophers who argues in favor for open borders is Joseph Carens in 1987. Based on Nozick and Rawls' argumentation, Carens developed a liberal-based approach. He consults Walzer's communitarian perspective to complete his standpoint. Carens refers to Nozick's theory, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. In his book, Nozick argues that the land of a nation is not a collective property of its citizen. The control that states can legitimately exercise over the land is therefore limited by the rights of the individual owners. Hence, for Nozick, prohibiting immigration is not part of the state's mandate. He proposes voluntarily closed small communities based on majority rule, where everyone is free to stay and leave. Further, in contrast to Nozick, Rawls argues for an active state with positive responsibilities for social welfare. Rawls' approach, Theory of Justice, written in 1971, is based on the so-called original position. That means people are in favor of equal liberties to all and social and economic inequalities. These inequalities he values as acceptable as long as people's basic needs are fulfilled and fair conditions for equal opportunities are provided. Carens compares the citizenship of liberal democracies as an equivalent of feudal privilege that is given persons by birth. Therefore, he argues that borders should be open based on the same reasons why we reject the feudal system. Referring to birthright and hence to the fair distributions of social benefits, including the freedom to migrate, the restrictions of immigration would thus oppose the natural original position of humans. Carens is using Rawls' approach to find cases when the liberty of migration could be restricted, even in an ideal world of no historical dispositions. If there is one reason, in Carens' opinion, it would be the situation when unrestricted immigration leads to chaos and breakdown of order and security. Hence, Carens is arguing for a relatively open border policy. In the last part of Carens' analysis, he is criticizing Walzer's communitarian approach. Carens is stating that we, the Western democracies, have the obligation to provide aid to those who are in need. Carens argues that immigrants should get access to full citizenship because exclusion starts when people have no right for self-determination, which is limited by, for example, having the status guest worker. Carens emphasizes that the liberal universal approach is the only legitimate way and thus has the power in our contemporary culture. It fits to our moral traditions. I quote, "For people in a different moral tradition, one that assumed fundamental moral differences between those inside the society and those outside, restrictions on immigration might be easy to justify. Those who are other simply might not count, or at least not count as much. But we cannot dismiss the aliens on the ground that they are other, because we are the products of our liberal culture." Further, in contrast to Nozick, Rawls argues for an active state with positive responsibilities for social welfare. Rawls' approach, Theory of Justice, written in 1971, is based on the so-called original position. That means people are in favor of equal liberties to all and social and economic inequalities. These inequalities he values as acceptable as long as people's basic needs are fulfilled and fair conditions for equal opportunities are provided. Carens compares the citizenship of liberal democracies as an equivalent of feudal privilege that is given persons by birth. Therefore, he argues that borders should be open based on the same reasons why we reject the feudal system. Referring to birthright and hence to the fair distributions of social benefits, including the freedom to migrate, the restrictions of immigration would thus oppose the natural original position of humans. Carens is using Rawls' approach to find cases when the liberty of migration could be restricted, even in an ideal world of no historical dispositions. If there is one reason, in Carens' opinion, it would be the situation when unrestricted immigration leads to chaos and breakdown of order and security. Hence, Carens is arguing for a relatively open border policy. In the last part of Carens' analysis, he is criticizing Walzer's communitarian approach. Carens is stating that we, the Western democracies, have the obligation to provide aid to those who are in need. Carens argues that immigrants should get access to full citizenship because exclusion starts when people have no right for self-determination, which is limited by, for example, having the status guest worker. Carens emphasizes that the liberal universal approach is the only legitimate way and thus has the power in our contemporary culture. It fits to our moral traditions. I quote, "For people in a different moral tradition, one that assumed fundamental moral differences between those inside the society and those outside, restrictions on immigration might be easy to justify. Those who are other simply might not count, or at least not count as much. But we cannot dismiss the aliens on the ground that they are other, because we are the products of our liberal culture."
To extend the argument of open border, I would like to take a step back and talk about the purposes and connotation of the border regime. As Agnew argued, border as territorial social formation are seen as the root of all identity. The boundaries, including borders, are defined by opposing an exclusionary identity that pre-exists the coming of the border. Sovereignty and self-rule are made through the territorial culture by the state. However, there are trends that mitigate against the exclusionary border regime. So to reconstruct and challenge the sovereignty pattern of borders, Agnew argued that it is imperative to refine the connotation of the border and question what border ought to be for and to the people affected. So based on the argument, border actually touched the debates among identity and othering in migration issue. If we take a broader look at the historical context of Europe, we may find out that symbolic border of Europe is based on European civilization, which, as Arthur stated, is a sum of property, all those material and moral acts that define European identity. There are specific acts behind, such as Christianity value or individualism, but this civilization per se have a contested cultural boundary. Islamic civilization across centuries has gradually become the carrier civilization that brought several influences to Europe as an outsider. Islamic civilization for Europe is not only an early attempt to destroy Europe's civilization from the outside, but also signify the corrupting moral environment that Europe must struggle to overcome from within. If we put that into context now today, assimilation is a common expectation that European civilization has. Such expectation derives from the essentialist belief that Muslim migrants could set aside historical barrier and learn to become an European. Such expectation is more problematic, definitely, since it hindered the recognition of Muslim identity as part of the European society, especially under democratic system. Therefore, border as a manifestation of sovereignty is ethically problematic that need to be reversed. The following debates in this regard are what concepts should be the right one to replace. during the refugee crisis, we could see that public debates on different positions toward migration policy are built on somehow irreconcilable claims. The Westphalian understanding of justice that are used to defend the superiority of citizens and selective immigration, it was repeatedly mentioned. But the subsequent way to counter is the humanitarian or cosmopolitan perspective, that to justice as impartiality, individuals have bases and universal rights that should be protected. But cosmopolitans stood on rather moderate position that accept the right to move but not the duty to welcome every migrant. On the other hand, humanitarian narrative was frequently found throughout the periods of crisis. However, it did not base on issues of the migrants' right, but more on the argument of the EU's benevolence and migrant victimization. The amateur and Lucario has argued that in the refugee crisis, European media have failed to provide stages to opinion of counter-narrative and pro-migrant claims from the position that go beyond the classist humanitarian approach, which portray migrants as victims of an undressed crisis. The idea of justice as recognition that emphasized the subjectivity of migrants and their agency eventually did not become the mainstream public discourses in the migration issues. Hence, the connotation of identities and boundaries are actually a quite dynamic interactive process. We could also see how migration issues are tightly intertwined with the continuation of European identity. However, discourses on the position toward migration policy are not only influenced by European civilization or Westphalian interpretation on justice. It has also a lot to do with the political institution of the EU nowadays and the internal struggles within. In an empirical study done by Peshkopia and his colleague, they found a correlation between supporting more migrants and supporting EU integration. There are two different pictures basically within EU after the refugee crisis, with the West support more migrants than before and connected the success of welcoming policy with consistent decision-making between EU political institutions and member states. However, the situation is totally opposite in the West, with less migrant wanted and people connected responsibility to refugees only with the EU institution but not with the local governments. The exclusionary and inclusionary identity are reasons provided by the author to explain such a different situation within the EU, how that happened, which is also reflected in the actual policies on border control and refugee burden sharing system. Having said that, we now could take a deeper look at how those identity and cultural factors work in the actual policy responses.
The European migrant crisis, also known as the refugee crisis, is a period characterized by high numbers of people arriving in the European Union overseas from across the Mediterranean Sea or overland through Southeast Europe. At the peak of the crisis in 2015, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees observed that the top three nationalities among over 1 million refugees arriving from the Mediterranean Sea were Syrian, 46.7%, Afghan, 20.9%, and Iraqi, 9.4%. Eurostat reported EU member states received over 1.2 million first-time asylum applications in 2015, more than twice as the previous year. 4 states, Germany, Hungary, Sweden and Austria, received around 2/3 of the EU's asylum application in 2015, with Hungary, Sweden and Austria being the top recipients for asylum applications per capita. Asylum is a fundamental right and an international obligation for countries as recognized in the 1951 Geneva Convention on the Protection of Refugees. EU countries have a shared responsibility to welcome asylum seekers in a dignified manner, ensuring that they are treated fairly and their case is examined following uniform standards. This ensures that, no matter where an applicant applies, the outcome will be similar. Procedures must be fair and effective throughout the EU. Thus, in 1999, the EU has established a common European asylum system based on the full and inclusive application of the Geneva Convention. The common European asylum system sets out common standards and cooperation to ensure that asylum seekers are treated equally in an open and fair system wherever they apply. The system is governed by 5 legislative instruments and 1 agency. It is based on the 3 main pillars: efficient asylum and return procedures, solidarity and fair share of responsibility, strengthened partnerships with third countries. Between 1999 and 2005, a number of legislative instruments establishing minimum standards for asylum were adopted. The Asylum Procedures Directive aims at setting out the conditions for fair, quick and quality asylum decisions. It is aimed at people with special needs and victims of torture. The Reception Conditions Directive ensures that common standards for reception conditions such as housing, food and clothing, and access to healthcare, education or employment under certain conditions are provided for asylum seekers across the EU. The Qualification Directive clarifies the grounds for granting international protection and therefore making asylum decisions more robust. It also provides access to rights and integration measures for beneficiaries of international protection. The Dublin Regulation enhances the protection of asylum seekers during the process of establishing the state responsible for application and clarifies the rules governing the relations between states. It creates a system to detect early problems in national asylum. The Eurodac regulation supports the determination of the member states responsible under the Dublin Regulation and allows law enforcement authorities access to the EU database of the fingerprints of asylum seekers under strictly limited circumstances in order to prevent, detect or investigate the most serious crimes such as murder or terrorism. The European Asylum Support Office is the agency which supports the implementation of the common European asylum system by member states by developing trainings, capacity buildings, emergency assistance, information and analysis, and third country cooperation activities. On this slide we can see the diagram which illustrates the most favorable countries for refugees in 2015, and as mentioned earlier, Germany, Hungary, Sweden and Austria at that time formed top 4 countries for refugees. The diagram on this slide shows the nationality of refugees coming into the European Union, and we can notice how significant is the amount of refugees from Syria, which accounts for 28.9%. The Eastern Mediterranean route refers to arrivals in Greece, Cyprus and Bulgaria. Large numbers of refugees seeking shelter from the Syrian civil war arrived in the EU via this route in 2015. Since then, the number of arrivals using this route has been greatly reduced thanks to the implementation of the EU-Turkish deal of March 2016. In 2019, arrivals via this route were 90% lower than in 2015, and a further decline was observed in 2020. The Western Mediterranean route refers to arrivals to Spain both by sea to mainland Spain and by land to Spanish enclave of Ceuta and Melilla in northern Africa. It is mostly used by migrants from Algeria and Morocco, but people from many sub-Saharan African countries also try to reach Europe via this route. Following a peak in 2018, Spain has seen a decrease in the number of arrivals. One major factor was the EU's investment in a close partnership with Morocco to help strengthen border control and combat trafficking of migrants. The Central Mediterranean route refers to sea arrivals to Italy and Malta. Migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa transit through Tunisia and Libya on their journey to Europe. This route to the EU was the most used route between 2015 and 2017. Following 2 years of low numbers of irregular migrants on the route, the number has greatly increased in 2020. The EU has taken concrete measures to address the migration situation in Libya and to tackle the root causes of migration in Africa. The diagram here shows the number of refugees from certain countries and through a certain route. On this slide, we can see the diagram which illustrates the total flow of refugees coming into the European Union from 2015 till 2021. And the routes, the preferences for route to be used by refugees as well.
After refugees were widely welcomed in 2015, public opinion slowly changed in Europe, partly because of the large numbers, partly because of incidences like those in Cologne city in Germany at New Year's in 2016. Within the context of a more restrictive public discourse, European governments were looking for ways to reduce the number of incoming refugees to the European Union. So the European Union reached out to Turkey, and after many meetings between the representatives of both parties, a deal was reached on March 18th of 2016. The main goal of this deal, from the European point of view, was the return of all refugees who came illegally from Turkey after the 20th of March 2016. The highlights of the deal. The European Union promised to accept up to 72,000 Syrians from Turkey via quotas. It was decided that Turkey would receive funds to provide relief to refugees residing on its territory. On the Greek side, the so-called hotspot approach was adopted. This means that all incoming refugees must stay on the Greek islands and are not allowed to leave the islands until they are returned to Turkey or until their asylum applications are examined. In other words, they are prevented from reaching the Greek mainland and then traveling through Europe. Greece also pledged that it would speed up the asylum procedures so that the asylum application would be decided within only 15 days. One of the main objectives of the deal was to stop human trafficking and smuggling gangs activity between the borders. Since 2016, public opinion has been divided along the line of those who support the deal and consider it to have achieved the desired goals, and those who reject it on the grounds of human rights and international law violations. Arguments for the deal are based on the fact that the statistics indicate a significant decrease in the number of incoming refugees. More than 1 million refugees arrived on the Greek islands before the deal. After 1 year, this number decreased to 26,000 refugees. They also refer to the low number of those who died due to drowning of the Greek coast. Between March 2015 and March 2016, 1,152 people died, whereas the number decreased to 81 in the following 12 months. They continue to argue that the aid and funds granted by the European Union to Turkey have contributed to improving the lives of those displaced and residing in Turkey. There are many statistics about this. For example, 500,000 Syrian children in Turkey were able to attend school, and 1,200,000 refugees receive monthly financial subsidies. Arguments against the deal are based on the humanitarian conditions in which the refugees on the Greek islands find themselves in. These conditions are related to the hotspot approach, which from this perspective is a violation of human rights and international law. The German Dr. Martin Bender, who volunteers on the Greek islands, described the situation as a great shame for Europe. In an interview, he describes the camps as prisons and mentions that many refugees do not have rights. For example, it's forbidden to go out for more than 4 hours a week. He also refers to the poor medical conditions of the refugees, including those who suffer psychologically. He criticizes the Greek authorities because they prevent doctors and NGOs from filming or preparing reports from inside the camps. Also, many reports from Amnesty International refer to the difficult humanitarian conditions, for example the tents in which the refugees reside and that are unsuitable for housing. From the humanitarian perspective, the detention of refugees in camps is inhumane, and refugees are the ones who are most affected by the Turkish-European deal. The criticism based on international law has denied the classification of Turkey as a safe third country. A safe third country is a legal term and means any state outside the European Union that is not the motherland of the refugees can be seen as a safe place for them. Many international laws set clear criteria for a state to be considered a safe third country. For example, according to Article 27 of the European Union Asylum Procedures Directive, a safe third country must be a full signatory to the Geneva Convention so refugees can apply for asylum. Refugees must not be forcibly deported from this state. The freedom and life of refugees in this country should not be threatened for reasons of nationality, religion, ethnicity, etc. The main criticism is that Turkey cannot be considered a safe third country, especially for Syrian refugees for several reasons. Turkey is not a full signatory to the Geneva Convention, and so it does not give asylum to Syrians. There are also many international reports indicating that Turkey has deported some Syrian refugees back to Syria or recruited them into military groups. Also, Turkey greatly restricts the work of international human rights organizations. These organizations don't have access to refugees. We see that supporters and opponents of the deal have a different theoretical understanding of the crisis. Supporters tend to view the refugee crisis as a security issue in the first place, and therefore reducing the number of incoming refugees would protect the EU's identity and enhance the security of the European borders. Opponents of the deal proceed from a cosmopolitan perspective, so to speak, and consider the refugee crisis a humanitarian crisis. Therefore, collecting refugees on islands under harsh humanitarian conditions, forcing them to return to Turkey under difficult circumstances, and risking deportation are considered as inhumane and against international law. What is the fate of the deal in the coming years? Gerald Knaus, one of the architects of this deal, explains in this interview the importance of renewing the deal and highlights the main points that must be modified. We will listen to just about 2 minutes of the interview together. Then we continue with questions we prepared for our discussion, and one is related to this interview.
This money has had a major impact. Today, 80% of young Syrians in Turkey say they want to stay. 700,000 children go to school. Syrian children go to school in Turkey. And the number of people crossing irregularly has dropped. So that has worked. Unfortunately, 1 year ago, after 4 years of choosing projects, the European Union has not put on the table a new offer for the next 5 years. Turkey has declared it would not take any more people back. And for the last year, the way the European Union has stopped arrivals has been through pushbacks, which is illegal against EU law and against the International Refugee Convention. And that needs to change as quickly as possible. And the only way to do that is to renew an agreement with Turkey that is based on international law.
Give us an idea of what the human impact of that is going to be.
Well, three things should happen urgently. I mean, Turkey should agree to take back again people who are safe in Turkey. The European Union should help Greece evacuate those terrible camps on the Greek islands, start with a new cut-off date, and then put on the table another serious offer to support Turkey. There are 5% of the Turkish population at the moment refugees and asylum seekers. It's the country with most refugees in the world and has been for many years. And for all the things one might criticize and could and should criticize about Turkish politics, in this respect, Turkey, Syrians in Turkey really deserve support.